We will then have Aishwarya Narayanan's paper. I will be the faculty commentator and Darshan will be the student commentator. We'll then have a coffee break and we'll finish with Chandani Chawla's paper. Professor Preetam Barawa will be here for that as the faculty commentator and Namrata Maheshwari will be the student commentator. Okay, let's begin with Anuj. 15 minutes, please.
Listen. I'm Anuj Singh from second year BLLB student from Symbiosis Law School, Pune. And I've co-authored this paper with Sneha Priya, but due to some commitment for moot court, she couldn't make appear here. So the topic of my research paper is politics in judicial decision making. So before entering into the research paper, I would like to start with the meaning of politics. So the meaning of politics is different for each of everyone. If you ask a common man, he will say, with reference to his MP and MLA, he will say that it is something increase in power of someone or promotion of their interest. But politics changes its faces. Politics changes its sphere. We have seen if we look back to the Indian politics, we have seen the change from left-wing agenda to right-wing agenda, which is of modern government, we can say. From secularism, which was regarded as a basic doctrine in S.R. Bommai, to communalism after the demolition of Babri Mosque. And recent development could be the pro-development politics to Aam Aadmi politics, which is currently prevailing. So the definition which I stick to of politics is that the politics identifies the complex of value of various natures such as economic, social and moral, as well as the processes through which such values are then chosen to be implemented by the public authoritative apparatus into the community using lawmaking. So what is law? Law has various meaning. Phil Fricke said that law without life is no more fundamental to a thriving societies than would be life without law. So according to Austrian law is a command of sovereign, and the jurisprudence which we have learned, the sources of law was told as custom, precedent, legislation as the sources of law. Article 13 also defines law of the Indian Constitution as bylaw, notification orders and legislation. Law can be subjected to change for legislature also by bringing an amendment, and for judiciary also for bringing a judicial legislation which is now prevailing, or we can say making a precedent. Contemporary legal theories depicts legal phenomena as voluntas regis, which means law shaped by political powers or dominated by its own ratio. That means law shaped by its internal rationality. There are two notions about the relationship between law and politics. That is, law is politics, which means law is flexible. It tends toward flexibility. It adapt according to the politics which is in the society, or law or politics, which is a Kelsen view, that it refers to the rigidity of the same form. It makes a something condition like law versus politics, because the law does not derive any content from politics. So if we go to the international perspective, basically we have divided the paper into international perspective and Indian perspective of law. So if we go through the international perspective, we can find various number of judgment which were influenced by the politics, such as one case for Dred Scott case, which was quite long ago, 1857, where at that time slavery was supported by the US legislature. So Dred Scott was a black person, and the Supreme Court decided that he is not a citizen. He cannot be a citizen of a US, and he has no right to sue, because the black don't hold right as compared to whites. And in the New Deal case, where it was a tussle between President Franklin D. Roosevelt and the US Supreme Court, I want to quote some excerpt of the speech which he gave in the February 5, 1937, that we have therefore reached a point as a nation where we must take action to save the Constitution from the court and the court from itself. We must find a way to take an appeal from Supreme Court to the Constitution itself. We want a Supreme Court that will do justice under the Constitution, not over it. Not in our courts, we want a government of laws and not of men. So in reply to this Franklin D. Roosevelt comment in the Congress, the court said that today it may be the court which is charged with forgetting its constitutional duties. Tomorrow it may be the Congress, and next day it may be the executive. Manifestly, if we may force force the hand of the court to secure our interpretation of constitution, then some succeeding Congress may repeat the process to secure another. So we have seen the various tenses where the Marbury versus Madison, which is one of the landmark cases which brought the concept of judicial review in the legal fraternity, which was also influenced by politics because the John Adams who appointed John Marshall and later on the John Marshall supported the President Jefferson view and not issued the writ of mandamus against for the appointment of appointment of judges made by John Adams. So in US, the judge Richard Posner, which is one of the judge of US Court of Appeal, who is often most highly cited judges of. So he said he was not made to US Supreme Court because of his antagonistic views to the president. So he said in his book of How Judges Think that, well, I don't like Supreme Court because I don't think it is a real court. And Justice William Brennan said most important law at Supreme Court is law of 5. That means it takes only 5 justices to declare a law to reach a decision. So we can, and today the conservative voting record of the court in appeals in criminal cases still bear the stamp of Ronald Reagan, one of the most and also one of the most well-known Republican President George Bush. So political party affiliation plays a very important role in the outcome of judicial decision in case of US. We can see the reversal of the judgment during appeal in Democratic with comparison to Republican judges. So Justice William O. Douglas voiced his concern in 1974 that if he resigned from the Supreme Court, then there will be no one on the court who cares for blacks, Chicanos, defendant and the environment. So we can see how the law and politics are intertwined. And now moving to judicial decision making process and politics. Judicial decision making is backed by a combination of reasoning which is abstract along with a judgment which is supported by moral values. There are 2 to 3 approach for judicial decision making. Deductivist approach that looks into the dispute, reduce it to the fact and then apply law, which I think which should be the least preferable approach. And inductivist makes it from particular to general. It does not consider rule as being naturally applicable. And precedent, the rationale behind precedent is where already law is settled, the judge should not interpret and evolve new. So this is the third approach for the judicial decision making. There has been indeed a number of instances where judges have surprised the appointment and goes against the political preferences of the president who appointed them. Such as Chief Justice Al Warren, the Justice William Brennan, who were nominated by Dwight Eisenhower, but they opposed, and most of the non-unanimous case which he laid down were not in the concurrence of that what one would predict what his judgment would be and his own personal and political views. So some believe that judgment should be given only to the respect of constitution and the interpretation should be only made by referring to it. But while many believes that the interpretation should be made according to the society. So judicial decision, as yesterday said by the Justice A.P. Shah, that it was not an easy process. You have to go to, according to the political scenario, you have to go to the society what it needs, such as we can see in section 337 or the recent judgment of section 66A. So the judge needs to be make a clear demarcation of the society need and what his political views or preferential views are. And we can see these views are prevalent even in ICJ. The case of Dattoparam Kumaraswamy, it's one of the landmark judgment where the difference of immunity was raised. And Dattoparam Kumaraswamy was a Malaysian jurist. He was appointed as the Commission Special Rapporteur to Malaysia to inquire into that whether to inquire into the independence of Malaysian judiciary and lawyers. So he was supposed to make 4 reports, but as soon as he submitted 2 reports, he gave an interview to the Malaysian magazine, and where he said that the judiciary of Malaysia is works under the 2 corporate firms. It works according to the 2 big corporate firms, as we alleged to the Narendra Modi that he works according to the Ambani and Adani. So as same as he alleged. But as soon as he gave that comment, the Supreme Court took the contempt notice. But later on, in ICJ and Secretary General, the ICJ and United Nations Secretary General took the view that he is entitled for the immunity from legal process of every kind of word, even it is defamatory or even it is not in compliance with the rules of the country. So, and there has been again and again the issue has been raised of fragmentation of ICJ. So maybe this could be a good idea, but the question which comes to my mind is whether fragmentation of ICJ would lead to the justice or it would lead to the negotiation between the parties. The more and more courts, whether it would be giving the justices or it would lead to the negotiation and conciliation, which are the new evolving concept within the countries, would it give the matter to the mediation. And the basic principle on the independence of judiciary was adopted by the 7th United Nations on the Congress on the Prevention of Crime and Treatment of Offenders at Milan, which says that judiciary shall decide matters impartially and decide only on the basis of fact and circumstances that come in front of it, and do so in accordance with the law, and the most importantly decide without any influence, inducement or any pressure, directly or indirectly. So now coming to the Indian perspective, before now going to separation of power. Firstly I am going to doctrinal approach, what the concept says. Firstly, the Aristotle described the separation of power, but he does not specifically stress on the separation of power. Then John Locke came in the second treatise of civil government, and finally the Montesquieu came in the spirit of laws. He said if power is concentrated in one organ, it could lead to the tyranny of its subject, and separating the function and power of all 3 organs could give the system of check and balance. So and the rationale behind this was the power holds power. So, and as the Lord Acton has said that power corrupts and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. So we and before going to the separation of power in respect to India, I would like to mention the Indira Gandhi's regime experience. What after the judgment of Indira Gandhi versus Raj Narayan, the Justice Jagan Mohan Lal Sinha of Allahabad High Court, he was the Indira Gandhi and Justice Jagmohan Lal Sinha was having the same doctor. So Indira Gandhi tried to approach the doctor, approach the justice for giving the judgment in favor of her through the doctor. And even she went to gave him the offer of Supreme Court judgeship. But as we all know, he gave the opposite judgment, and he was not went for the Supreme Court judgeship. And Mrs. Gandhi then took the result of Article 352 of the Constitution, and because of a pliable President, Mr. Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad, he didn't take any action and not raise any voice. And as earlier 2 years ago, Keshavanand Bharati case was decided, the basic feature doctrine was there, but they didn't. The President did not pay heed to that. And followed by this, Indira Gandhi brought number of amendments from such as Supreme Court's power from hearing election process, the High Court for hearing constitutionality of central laws, and she even abolished the need of quorum in Parliament and state legislature in passing any law. So that was something a suicide of a democracy. And but what I see, even though the president was not so strong, but the court should have taken the cognizance in the ATM Jabalpur case. That was our biggest opportunity given to the Supreme Court. So only the Justice H.R. Khanna took that courage and gave the dissenting judgment. And they said no person has any local standi to move the court under the Article 226 for giving the writ of habeas corpus. So and the emergency could have been collapsed immediately as soon as it came into the effect, but court, either due to fear or some political compulsion, they refused to do so. And later after this, we have seen how they paid the price of giving dissenting judgment. They were H.R. Khanna, Manira Shelat, K.S. Hegde was superseded by the judges. So and most of the judges who didn't favor and the populist ideology were transferred. More than 17 judges were transferred, and 3 judges cases came. Then even Bhagwati said that he apologized last year for giving his judgment in favor of Indira Gandhi in ADM Jabalpur case. So is separation of power panacea for all the ills in India? The Indian Supreme Court took a long view from, if we go from Anwar Ali Sarkar versus State of West Bengal and A.K. Gopalan, which we have studied, where judiciary clearly refused to intervene in the matters of legislature, because they said there is a doctrine of separation of power. But this become a tool for harassment for a legislature legislature of its subject. Later in Maneka Gandhi, the court brought and interpreted the procedure established by law to American due process of law. So when this could be done at the time of framing of constitution. There's a story behind that. The Ambedkar, while he was drafting the constitution, he went to US and he discussed it with the Justice Frankfurter that how due process law is going. So Justice Frankfurter immediately he requested that please don't put due process of law in our constitution, because it is not doing what it is expected in the American constitution. So, but we have seen it has expanded the horizons of judicial activism and judicial interpretation, from right to sleep, right to health, right to eat, and it is going on. So Article 21, the right to life and personal liberty, has become a tool for bringing major changes. But although the judicial activism is a positive feature for working out democracy, but it is overextending or over judicial activism, which Markandeya Katju says, is not a solution. The over judicial activism it's actually a trespass to the authority and administration of other authority, and it is not a good sign for administrative machinery. We have seen in Vineet Narayan versus Union of India, the court invented a new writ despite continuing mandamus to monitor investigation agencies. And even the power of speaker was brought under judicial review in spite of the clear majority or precedent review. It was brought under judicial review. So the court intervening is again and again in the legislative part could be a positive feature, but over intervention of judiciary could result into the deadlock between the three organs of the government. And Justice Frankfurter said that all power is in medicine phase of an encroaching nature. Judicial power is not immune against this human weakness. It also must be on the guard against encroaching beyond its proper hands, and not the less so, since the only restraint upon it is self-restraint. So vesting more power on one organ could lead to arbitrary and despotic rule. And the current system which is prevailing in India is quite good, but I think that there should be no doctrine of separation or express doctrine separation of power, although it is made in Article 50 of DPSP for demarcation of executive and judiciary, but clear demarcation as America should not be there. And now moving to the conflict of personal laws, we have seen when it comes to the personal laws, the focus shift from being secular and equal to viewed in isolation, as the issues relate to the way of life and touches the religious sentiments. So K.M. Munshi, he was a big supporter of bringing UCC, Uniform Civil Code, and he said that secular law governing every aspect of individual's life, by stating that any consolidating unifying personal law, the way of life of the whole country would get unifying character. So this could be the rationale behind bringing Article 44 of the Constitution, advocating Article UCC. But there has been a long tussle between judiciary and executive, and even within the judiciary on maintaining status quo in personal laws. We have seen earlier the court think that the personal laws are not susceptible to the fundamental rights. a large number of cases were decided because of the absence of word personal laws in 13 clause 3. So, but later on, the Supreme Court changed its view, and it said that after the basic structure doctrine, and it commented that the basic structure permeates equality of status and opportunity. The personal laws conferring inferior status on women and are anathema to equality. Personal laws are derived not from the constitution but from the religious scriptures. Thus, the law derived must be consistent with the constitution, lest they become void under Article 13 if they violate the fundamental right. So, they decided to test the personal laws on the touchstone of fundamental rights, which is a very remarkable thing for the Indian judiciary. And after that, the Shah Banu case came, which showed the conflict in law and politics, and whether the question was asked whether the obligation of Muslim husband of maintaining divorced wife, and the court made it under the section 125 of CRPC and said that section 125 is a secular law and it does not it goes par with the religion. So, but we immediately the politics was there. Immediately Rajiv Gandhi government, who with this because the Muslim community was so much in anger, and he brought the Muslim Women Protection of the Right on Divorce Act 1986 to nullify the Shah Banu's judgment by making the provision of fair and reasonable maintenance to be given by husband. Later in Daniel Latifi, who is a lawyer of Shah Banu, he later in 1986 2000 the challenge the constitutional validity of the act, but the Supreme Court took the pro-human right approach and held that the act had to be read in the conjunction with the right to equality and to life with a dignity provided under the Article 14 and 21 in the Constitution. So now we have seen as the modern development such as the National Judicial Appointment Commission, which is I think is according to which gives justify the reasoning in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Article 10, that everyone is entitled in full equality to a fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial tribunal in the determination of his right and obligation of any criminal charge against him. So the issues raised yesterday by the Justice Shah, that the clause of eminent personality not legal and the veto power, these are the issue. But what I think is whatever the final the Falis Nariman who has challenged the constitutional validity of NJAC, who was earlier the supporter of collegian system and he was opposing collegian system but now supporter of collegian system. So whatever the result came after the Supreme Court analysis, but in the words of Krishna Iyer, that the process of appointment should be just, fair and reasonable, not arbitrary, fanciful and oppressive. So the question, I want to conclude by the question that is politics bad for law? We have seen both the sides of the politics shaping the judicial behavior. Does the politics shape judicial behavior? Does legislation, which is itself per se a source of law, is influenced by the politics? Such as we can think the UCC, which might come in Narendra Modi regime, would be influenced by his right-wing agenda. So the legislation is a big source of law which is affected by politics. And the answer to both question and this question needs a subjective analysis of the series of the events and the arguments also. And the independent, impartial judiciary is an essential feature of democracy, but impartiality refers to the state of mind. Independence refers not only to the state of mind but the attitude with and the relation with others parts of the government. So, ending with the US Supreme Court comment on the independence of judiciary, that legitimacy of the judicial branch depends on its reputation for impartiality and non-partisanship. That reputation may not be borrowed by the political branches to cloak their work in the neutral colors of judicial action. Thanks.
Thank you.
Included secularism because the politics, you balanced out politics with religion and with judicial making, how like three of them were intertwined between each other. And so coming on to the improvement parts, as the abstract says, you could have included the indication that it had a world perspective, because it started with what is the definition of the meaning. You started with the whole Indian idea, but the abstract doesn't give any indication that you actually discussed ICJ or world perspective, or you even analyzed US or UK for that matter. So it could be like nice if some kind of an indication was there on your argument about what US or UK said. Secondly, citation wise, I think like because it's a 7,000 word essay and like with versus 40 citations, I think there's scope of more authority, because many places like where there were facts and all that, it wasn't like particularly cited. So like that could be scope of improvement. Thirdly, like when the parting of the paragraphs have happened, because you have included without any numbering the International Court of Justice and everything. So like A bit, B bit, C bit. So it says like, so I didn't know which section judicial decision making and politics time for a clear demarcation came under, like whether it came under the UK or whether you wanted UK and US together like as a line or with India. So it makes more logical sense in that way. And like, so there could be more scope of editing also, because where in the US you've stated about what ought to be done in politics. So like there was less mentioning about the US stance. So there was like what judges ought to do rather than what the US is practicing. So when the section is starting from US, the third paragraph says their practice. The first two paragraphs are just talking about what they ought to do. So the ought could be later, so that like, so that is your argument, right? Ought. So the first part would include the what US stance is, then the ought part. And like lastly, because like the question that you've raised in your conclusion is politics bad for law, like that is the conclusion where you've started the question with. So if there could be more analysis between why you've chosen US, India and UK, because it is important why, like what is the differences of opinion each country has by itself, and in the judiciary, what do you even support, and like which could be better and which probably is most supporting separation of powers, because you have included separation of powers in India. So that analysis part, what you think about it, could be included more for a better understanding of a reader.
Tradition of debating the relationship between law and politics, which is a very old tradition, and we should be rest assured that if we convene 50 years from now in this room, it will still be as timeless an issue as it has ever been. So there have been a lot of actors who have shaped the debate, and more than actors, if you think in terms of schools of thought which have come on this issue, there is that formalist idea that what the judges do is apply law to facts, and they are not really, the cases are not determined on the basis of facts alone, but on the basis of law and what the outcome of applying that law to particular facts will be. So judges should not predetermine the interpretation of law by looking at facts, but rather apply law to facts, right? And there is also, on the other side of the spectrum, there has been this thought in at least the legal realism school, that what judges do is actually just apply politics and policy preference, and law is merely a sort of a mask to justify their policy preferences. And in the middle somewhere there is a more sophisticated sort of a realistic understanding of the legal process itself, which delves not merely into politics understood in a very diffuse sort of a sense, or law understood in a very rootless sort of a sense, but talks also about the sociology of judging. It talks about the institutional limits on discretion. It also talks about how sometimes both law and politics can coexist without actually challenging each other, right? So sometimes the decision you take is actually supported both by law and by the political and public opinion at that point of time. So there is no real conflict as such. So I liked many aspects of the paper, and I like the ambition in the paper of trying to move beyond a particular sort of jurisdiction and make it and take this issue as if it is at the heart of constitutional governance. It's not an issue which is sort of topical only in India. It's an issue which is relevant in all jurisdictions which have a constitution, which have a judiciary, and which has a parliament, right? And also particularly like the fact that you speak about ICJ and supranational organizations and what really is the legitimacy, what is the basis of legitimacy of them giving opinion if we broaden the idea of sovereignty. I mean, what is it, why is it that they carry this sort of persuasive power or legitimacy, right? So I really like many things in the paper, and my comments are more or less motivated by a sense that you should carry this work forward, and it'll be a long sort of commitment. But let me make like some specific points relating to how you could develop this paper further, right? So you start with the right question. By asking that in what sense is politics bad for law or for judicial behavior or judicial decision making. People would say that, I mean, and there is a difference of opinion on two aspects of this question. If you think about whether politics shapes law, you will get two answers, yes and no, right? And somewhere in the middle people would say both yes and no. But more or less there will be people who say no, not at all. That's not what judges do. And some would say that yes, that is what judges do. And you can sort of mobilize a lot of evidence to justify both these positions. But my sense, and then you try to reach a conclusion that these are the facts, this is the evidence, this is what judges did in these cases. And now we want to reach a conclusion, a normative conclusion, that it is problematic for some reason. So when we reach that conclusion, we have to reach that conclusion on the basis of some theory of constitutional government, right? It's as if we have agreed that there is a certain way in which judges will decide. They will approach certain principles. So what is that theory of constitutional government? It's something which the paper would benefit from talking about in the first part itself. On what theory of constitutional government is the intermingling of law and politics bad? Or it's bad in what sense of the term, right? If you think about the multiple meanings of politics in judicial lawmaking, what all could it be? It could be its responsiveness to public opinion. It could be its responsiveness to other institutions, other political institutions. It could be personal ideology of judges. It could be the discretion which the judges have in choosing between two legally defensible outcomes, right? There is not just one outcome which is coming out of a case. You might choose between 2 or 3 different outcomes. And there could be all sorts of things, from strategic behavior to the fact that law itself is indeterminate in many cases. So there also you will say that what the judge has done is not really look to law, but look to something else beyond law, because law itself is indeterminate in this case. So in the first part of the paper, if you also discuss the number of, we can't exhaust the meanings of politics itself, but it'll be nice if we could talk about some settled meaning of what politics means in lawmaking, and then try to ground our arguments in response to those understanding, those sort of understanding. And so suppose, let's assume that it is bad in some sense or the other. There is some sort of agreement that politics is bad for judicial decision making, and it's supported by a number of theories. So how could we check it, or what should be our response? And there you could look at something like institutional rules for reaching decisions. So Supreme Court might have convention, precedent is one of those rules, and even like informal sort of rules within the Supreme Court as to how you move beyond precedent. You could look at something like public reason, right? There is this idea of public reason, which means that you should try and justify a decision not on the basis of your own ideology, but on the basis of some reasons which are common to everyone else who might have very different interests from you. So we are discussing in a group, between a group of people who have very different ideologies, but we agree on the ground rules of our engagement. So that is what public reasoning is. So how public reasoning can be a check in preventing the seeping of politics into daily sort of judicial lawmaking, right? So, I mean, these are some of the ways. And then constitutionalism itself. We talk about a culture of constitutionalism. So what do we mean by this culture of constitutionalism? In what way can it be an effective sort of a check? So these are some of the thoughts which I think should take this paper in different directions and should keep you occupied with this project. And finally, just as something to think about, the relationship between law and politics is really at the center of this debate. To do any justice to this project, you really have to get deeper into the relationship between what law and politics is and where the law gets its legitimacy from. And just think about this. When we come up with a constitution has both legal principles and political sort of outcomes, right? Every constitution is aspirational in some way or the other. It is contextual to the society's needs and anxieties at a particular point of time. And at the same time, it also wants to make the constitution timeless, in the sense not preoccupied by the exigencies of the time, but also make it relevant to a future which might have very different concerns, right? So think about that. A law which is not contextual, what legitimacy will it have? Which does not respond to a political sort of a context, what legitimacy will it have? At the same time, a politics which is not grounded in legal process or due process, will it also have any legitimacy? So I don't think law and politics can escape each other, but they have some sort of a delicate sort of an arrangement or understanding that this is how and this is why both of us matter to each other. And exploring that contract, I think, is really what your project is. Right? Thank you so much.
Look at your paper, it's very well presented, but you've got a bird's view, if that makes any sense. That means, see, now politics is evergreen, yes, but I think, according to me, if you just picked up a fixed period, because if you're going to look at the whole constitutional law and the decisions have been granted since when? I mean, you'll have your first Maneka Gandhi period, then the 1990s period, then you have the 2000 period, then you have a Daniel Latifi period. So you're covering a whole array of debates and policies. So I think another way to look at it is pick up particular political regimes like UPA 1, UPA 2, then Narendra Modi's regime, and then do it, have a specific time period for every block of decision making with respect to political decisions taken by the parliament and so on and so forth. So if you divide the work like that, then you'll see, has there been a change in judicial decision making? Has there been a consistent when UPA 1 and justices from Supreme Court have given decisions, are they in consonance with the block 2 where UPA 2 and another judicial decisions, and whether it will change with the current change in government? So that way you could see that politics has either played a role in judicial decision making or they have not. So if you do it, you'll get a proper comparative analysis of how every political bloc plays or does not play a role in cases.
Of the cases, because if you look at it, so the personal laws as such have never been declared unconstitutional, right? Although they could have on the grounds that they are violating with the right to equality or with the principle of secularism. And if you look at the cases, you see that there are different strategies of reluctance or of not engaging with the constitutionality of those laws. So on the very early, you have this Bombay High Court decision where they say actually the personal laws are not laws in the sense of Article 13, they're customs and hence they're not laws. So we don't have to check their constitutionality. Then the other strategy is to say, well, that's the legislator's task. Article 44, the legislator should finally make this UCC. It's not our job to bring about equality in that sense. And the other thing is to read the laws down a bit. So they're still in existence, but then they would interpret them in a different way and then say, actually we interpret them in a more gender-friendly manner or whatever. And there's one quote that you did mention where they said actually, where the Supreme Court said, but they should be in accordance with the Constitution. That was an obiter dicta and didn't have any effect in the end, right? So in the end, the courts or the judiciary is avoiding to engage with the constitutionality. And what does that mean? What does that mean about their role in compared to the legislator, compared to executive? And maybe they don't. Why would they avoid to engage in this? Because they might not want to interfere with religious communities for certain reasons. Or I think that's an interesting point to pick up and then further develop some thoughts on that.
One of the most fertile grounds for pushing this, for taking this project forward.
The dominant political ideology of that time has a more significant impact, whether it's in the obiter, where they're discussing the context in which they're deciding the decision, or whether the ideology impacts the decision itself. So I think that might be an interesting way of analyzing the cases in a certain time period.
Kennedy, because the laws, it seems like an organic whole, which is a self-contained code for governance, except you realize that it's a part of something else, that it's not an organic whole. And politics is largely the structure in which law exists. So it's almost like objectivity and impartiality, etc., don't really exist. They cannot exist. So, I mean, that's interesting.
Paper. And it's almost it's like, was it Fez or somebody yesterday said, a paper should be the opposite of a mystery story. You should know exactly what the outcome is at the beginning. And from your abstract, and especially from your introduction, I have literally no idea what you're going to say for the rest of the paper. There's not even a hint that you're going to talk about the ICJ, much less the US, much less the UK, okay? In addition to that, it seems like you're talking about two different things, and Satya, I think, alluded to this briefly as well, which I think are actually two separate papers, because they're both completely, they involve different factors, and they're not necessarily related. One is the politics of judicial appointments, which you get into a great deal. Now, this is a question of how you design institutions to pick the best people or diverse set of people or whatever. But it's hard to see how politics would be inappropriate there, because politicians in many countries actually choose judges, right? The question is, how do you make the institutional constraints such that they do it in a fair way? But there's clearly politics there. And then there's the second problem, which is, even if it's a politicized process, they might pick a judge who is apolitical, right? Or who isn't influenced by politics. So even Indira Gandhi picking justices out of turn, that doesn't mean that those justices will necessarily decide cases in a certain way. Right? There isn't a direct link. It's a link that you would have to substantiate and make, and you'd also have to show that they are more biased than judges who aren't picked in the way that Indira Gandhi picked them, right? So it's a very different kind of analysis, as opposed to the politics of judicial decision making, which is a completely separate enterprise about how judges actually think. Yeah? And for me, this is quite separate from the appointments process. And on that point, the judicial decision making, and you allude to this a little bit, but there are these, and Satya also alluded to this, there's this, there's the kind of very crude version of this, which we can call low politics, right? Judge X doesn't like law Y, therefore he strikes down law Y. Yeah? That's a very crude version of things. When that kind of thing appears to happen, and you ask a judge about it, they will always say the following, which is, it's not low politics, it's high politics, meaning this actually comports better with my understanding of the Constitution, right? So I'll give you a really simple example, which is the Obamacare case in the US, right? The one, not the current one, the one from 2012, which is a good case for you to look at for this. Now, in that case, it was widely believed that the 5 conservative justices on the Supreme Court would strike down Obamacare. And then, if rumors are to be believed, that's exactly what was going to happen, until the Chief Justice thought, this is going to look really bad, I'm going to switch and uphold the law. Okay? Now, we don't know if that's true, but that's apparently what certain law clerks said, and maybe it is true. But the point is that if he did that, that would be, I think, an example of low politics, because that has nothing to do with his constitutional view. But then that leads to the question, what about the other conservative justices? Now, in my view, and this, again, there's a normative kind of point here, in my view, the challenge against Obamacare was utterly ridiculous as a legal matter, right? I'm not a huge fan of the law. I just think as a legal matter it was ridiculous. But the other 4 conservative justices were able to cloak their disagreement with this in the language of high politics. So they were able to say it violates the Commerce Clause, it's problematic in this way, it's disrespectful to states, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm not at all convinced that that's any different from what John Roberts did, right? But they're cloaking it in a language of high politics. And so there needs to be some engagement with how we can tell the difference between the two. I think you kind of hint that they both exist, but there are many questions, right? One is, do these things actually exist? If they do exist, is high politics an okay way of doing things, right? Is it okay that a judge has very strong views about what the Constitution means? Should they be a little bit more open-minded? So there's a lot there, but I really think you need to very clearly demarcate when you're talking about, going back to my initial point, when you're talking about judicial appointments and the politics of that, and then the judicial decision-making, because they're completely different. And if I were you, I would write 2 separate papers so you can go into detail about each one.
I'm Aishwarya Narayanan. I'm from Nalchar, Hyderabad. And the topic that I chose for my paper was judicial pronouncements and social movements, reconciling rights, gender discrimination, and religion. So if you read my abstract, you realize that my initial plan, my intention was to work on a quasi-comparative framework to actually compare the laws of the US, the reactions that US court judgments invoke with those in India. But on Professor Abhiratne's direction, I chose to let go of that part and concentrated myself only on Indian judgments. But to my detriment, the judgments that I have chosen have been spoken about time and again during the course of this conference. So you'll just have to listen to it once more. I'm really sorry about that. And as we've seen with this conference, the starting point of this discussion has to be Montesquieu's definition of separation of powers. So in that idea of separation of powers, the courts were envisaged as a neutral arbiter of law, a settler of dispute, which was supposed to be apolitical and not engage with any sort of social movements. But what has come to be seen now is a change in the role of the court, in the attitudes of the court. And what we have seen is that judicial decisions tend to generate public debate and act as catalysts for social movements. And the impact that courts have on legislations is particularly noticeable because by pronouncing authoritatively on an issue, courts often generate debate and act as an impetus for any sort of legislative action and also resolve conflicts that mostly politically minded legislatures would not like to resolve. Now, what I have actually done in my paper is reviewed 3 important judgments. The first is the Shah Bano case, the second is the Aruna Shanbhag case, and the third is the Nas Foundation case. Now, my analysis is not just restricted to the impact of this on the affected groups, but also on how these judgments impacted the legislature and what sort of legislative reform we saw in reaction to these judgments. So, we start off with the Shah Bano case, which was very aptly summarized by Anuj. I've looked at this in basically 3 parts. The first part is the reactions that we saw to the Shah Bano judgment. The second part is why we had these reactions in the first place. And the third part is basically what happened thereafter. Now, the reactions come in 2 quarters. The first is the support, the overwhelming support that we saw from all sorts of feminist groups, from individual rights groups, and the opposition that we saw from Muslim conservatives. Now, why was this sort of opposition from the Muslim conservatives? It's because the way in which that judgment has been written. Now, instead of saying stuff like social justice, equality before the law, what the Supreme Court in Shah Bano did is it tried to interpret the Quran and said that Section 125 of the Criminal Procedure Code is not against the provisions of Muslim personal law. And the idea of a Hindu court interpreting Muslim law provisions was something which did not go down well with the Muslim community. And that's why you had controversy, you had riots, you had opposition. In all this chaos, what eventually happened to Shah Bano was that she was forced to renounce and reject the judgment, and she went on to say that I reject any judgment which goes against the Islamic Shariat. But all this aside, if you look at the response of the politicians, Rajiv Gandhi passed the Muslim Women's Act of 1986, which was a knee-jerk reaction to this judgment. Because immediately after this judgment was delivered, in December 1985, you had certain by-elections in Bihar, in Uttar Pradesh, which the Congress lost by a huge majority, and this was attributed to a loss in the Muslim vote bank. Now, to rectify this and the so-called damage which was done by the Shah Bano judgment, this act was passed. And this act basically relegated Muslim women to second-class citizens who cannot claim for maintenance from the husband, and they have to go to their paternal family on divorce. So, this judgment, in my analysis, is one example of where a positive approach which is taken by the court acts as a catalyst for regressive legislation. This is one case where politics trumps over any sort of individual justice, where the ultimate political interests of the executive overturn any sort of judicial decision making. So this is one sort of response that the judiciary is capable of eliciting. The second case in my paper is Aruna Shanbag. Now, again, if you look at the reactions that it drew, the two primary reactions, one is from the medical fraternity, which welcomed the judgment, that people who are in a permanent vegetative state deserve to be given a dignified way to die, and the sort of powers that were given to the doctors, it was much appreciated. And the criticism again came from religious quarters, the sanctity of life, the sacrosanct nature of life. The criticism also came from quarters from people who do not really trust our medical ethics, the low level of healthcare facilities in our country. And this is actually a valid criticism, because if you look at the health system in India, it is rather questionable. But here also I feel that this is not an overarching consideration, because the sort of power that's been given to the High Court to determine which cases are fit for euthanasia kind of sets this off, at least to a certain extent. But the most important point about this case is the recent decision taken by the government to scrap Section 309 of the IPC and therefore decriminalize the attempt to commit suicide. Now, this was a recommendation that was made by the Supreme Court when this judgment was delivered. On the basis of the recommendation of the Law Commission in the 210th report, the government has finally decided to drop this. We have the approval of 22 states and UTs, and on this basis, a note has been circulated by the Home Ministry to other departments, and hopefully very soon we will see this being passed into law. And this case, I used to demonstrate the positive effect that a judicial pronouncement might have on the legislature. So by bringing a topic into the public domain, by initiating debate, you provide impetuous direction to social policy and guide the legislature in taking positive reforms. Now, the third case in my paper was the Naus Foundation judgment, and this I've traced back right from the time of the Delhi High Court judgment. Now, the High Court judgment was obviously welcomed by the LGBT community, who saw an equal opportunity at citizenship, a language of inclusiveness, rights to a community which has been marginalized since time immemorial. And the opposition, as usual, was from the religious groups. Now, the remarkable fact about this case is that it was not the state which filed the appeal. The Union of India refused to file an appeal, saying that there was no error in law. The appeal was filed, the first person to file the appeal was an astrologer called Suresh Kumar Kaushal. And along with him, you had a number of religious groups, Christian groups, Muslim groups, who went ahead and registered the appeal. Now, when the judgment was finally delivered by the Supreme Court, after around 1.5 years of sitting on it, the judgment came as a shock to the LGBT community. And the sort of criticism that you see of this judgment is remarkably thin in legal analysis, poorly reasoned judgment. It is constitutionally egregious. So the sort of reactions that you see, these are the reactions from the legal fraternity. And the approach taken by the judges, the judges go on to say that the LGBT community is a minuscule fraction of the Indian population, and their so-called rights will be infringed, which is not really a problem, So the sort of attitude that is taken by the court in this case is inherently problematic. And the claim that they're exercising judicial restraint, this is probably something that Chandni will deal with in greater detail, is what is seen as abdication instead of restraint. But the problem that has happened by this restraint, so-called restraint, and a total transfer of the burden on the parliament to take up the mantle and pass a law, is that the focus has now shifted from LGBT rights to the role of the court. So a lot of discussion that came after this after this decision was how the court was abdicating its responsibility of what the role of the court should have been in a democratic society, about how the court has been an upholder of rights and has suddenly seems to have lost its way. And another problem with leaving everything to the parliament is that the parliament is at the end of the day a political body, which is going to give which is going to take account of the views of conservative sections of society. And this being a really contentious issue, I personally do not see any change in law, at least in the near future. And a very, very recent example of this would be the resolution floated by Russia in the UNGA, which asked for not giving equal rights to same-sex partners in the UN, which India supported. So with this sort of an attitude, is there really going to be change? I have my doubts. Now, when we look at the conclusion to this, what I wanted to prove by this paper is that irrespective of what the actual judgment be, the fact is that by virtue of being a judgment of the Supreme Court, the word of the Supreme Court is capable of creating social movements, of initiating change, and of generating debate. In the first two cases we saw, in Shah Banu and Aruna Shanbhag, we saw a pro-rights approach by the court. And this pro-right approach led to the people picking up that approach. In the first case, the sad part is that it got overturned by regressive legislation, while in the second part, you see the legislature also taking up the mantle and adopting the approach which is taken up by the court. In the NAS Foundation, despite a not so favorable judgment, this has just brought the issue of LGBT rights back into the focus and increased the demand for legislation which gives rights to LGBT people. So irrespective of what your judgment is, the point is the social movement has been started and the judgment has served as a foundation for the social movement. Now, this was something that I found out at the end of my paper, after I'd written something, and this was not something I thought of before, was one common factor which is there in all these cases. And this is the complete absence of the protagonist in the story that unfolds after your judgment is passed. And just look at each of these cases individually. What happened in Shah Banu? Shah Banu was basically a case of one woman claiming maintenance from her husband. But everything that happened later, it just became a matter of communalism, of politics, of marginalization. Where did Shah Banu go in this debate? She lies forgotten. Look at Aruna Shanbhag. The court has permitted passive euthanasia, but the woman herself got no respite. She herself got no remedy. What happened in the NAS Foundation case? The LGBT rights have been violated, right? Despite whatever the public response might be. But the fact is the attention has now been shifted to the role of the courts instead of the rights of the LGBT people. So this is a very interesting facet about how public opinion and social movements tend to move away from the initial stakeholders and look at larger matters, which is supposed to concern society as a whole. Now, a small point about the importance of this sort of public debate to democracy. The idea of a participatory democracy requires public participation, informed debate, and these judgments often serve as a basis for generating opinions, and social movements provide a platform for persons to express these opinions and therefore contribute to the sustenance of a modern democracy, of true democratic ideals, if I may. And on a concluding note, what I also looked into is the role of the media. Now, most people don't really have access to judicial pronouncements. Most people don't have the time or the energy to actually sit through and read judgments. So the only access that you have to these judgments is via the media. So sensationalism and the way in which the media portrays judgments plays a large role in influencing the way that people react to them and the sort of social change that it creates. And this is something that was said by Will Rogers way back in 1950, that all I know is what I read in the papers, and this is often an excuse for my ambiguity. And this is so true even today. However, this is something which is to be a subject of another paper, and with this I conclude.
It's very well written, it's very well argued. It's even well edited. There are a few typos here and there, but the footnotes are good, they're informative, it's well organized. One thing I really appreciated about Aishwarya's paper, and I really encourage all of you to do this, is at the end of her introduction, she has a paragraph that says, I selected these cases for 3 main reasons, and tells us exactly why she picked the cases she picked, and does a very convincing job of telling you that this was a good idea. this is a really, really good practice to get into because it shows that she's really thought about the bigger questions of methodology, of why these cases are important, about what her paper is seeking to advance. And it also just gives the reader an idea of how she's thinking about these things, right? So I really, really appreciated that. I have a few comments. I'll split these into I think Darshan has specific comments about the cases, so I'll refrain from talking about that. I'll give you what I call big picture comments about the paper as a whole, then I'll give you a few specific pointers. I think my first and most critical comment, Aishwarya, is that I think there's some conceptual confusion here in a couple of ways, and I think it detracts from your arguments. So on page 2, I wish we had page numbers, but anyway, on page 2, you say that judgments are capable of initiating social movements. That's a lot of credit to give to judgments. I wouldn't say they initiate social movements. Maybe they help spur social movements. Maybe they contribute to social movements. In fact, I think for the most part, it's exactly the opposite. That is to say, there's a social movement, and then they bring themselves to the courts, right? And this has been widely written about, Upendra Bakshi's famous paper, Taking Suffering Seriously. It's all about how the judiciary has assumed this mantle of being the forum for social movements, largely because the other institutions have been dysfunctional or ineffective, right? So there's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing here, and I think you can just avoid that by using a less controversial word than initiate. I think just by saying judicial or judgments contribute to social movements or have an impact on social movements will give you everything you need for your paper without this confusion about whether they initiate, because that's very difficult to prove, and I actually don't think that's what's happening, okay? The other distinction that I think you sometimes blur is the difference between social movements and legislative change. You seem to think of these as two very different things, and I'm not sure that's right either. I mean, by social, I take it you mean sort of grassroots movements that happen around a judgment and maybe sometimes affect legislative change. But again, it's not as if there's a social movement and then the legislature is sitting on its own and it creates a law, right? These things are quite intertwined often, and again, it's the social movement that leads to the legislative change. So you think of something like the Domestic Violence Act, for instance, or the outcry with the rape stuff happening and the changes in the IPC. There, I don't think there's much of a blur. There's not much of a line between the social movement and the legislative change, right? I mean, they're very closely intertwined. So by saying there's a social and then there's a legislative component, that's true, but I think you need to look at a little bit how they're related, and if they are different, how are they different, right? Can we think of the social as, can you define social movements in a way that maybe is different from legislative change? I'm just giving you sort of ideas for ways that you can try to define these terms, okay? And the other major criticism I have, you actually just addressed it yourself, is that I don't think you pay sufficient attention to media once you raise it. Yeah. So it's almost like a throwaway line, like, actually it's not the judges, it's the media that's the problem. But as you yourself admitted, you kind of have one line about it in the intro and then you barely address it later. Do what you said. Eliminate it altogether. That's a really interesting second paper. I would keep that out altogether. So those are my big picture comments. My small picture comments are, some are petty and some are not. Petty comment. You need to be a little careful with things like typos. This was, like I said, very well done overall, but like just for instance, Montesquieu did not create a hierarchy of powers, but instead aimed at creating a system of restraints, and by which you mean restraints, right? Again, that's nitpicky, but again, it goes back to something Fez said yesterday, which is when you're presenting a paper at a conference, there's a certain amount of professionalism that you want to show, right? So making these things look polished is useful. Slightly less petty, I really didn't like your Shabano quote at the beginning. So the quote at the beginning says, this appeal, this is in the Shabano case, the court says, this appeal does not involve any question of constitutional importance. And you repeat that throughout the paper as if to mean that the court thought the case wasn't important. No, they're just saying it's not a constitutional case. And it's not a constitutional case. As you yourself said, it's a criminal law case and it's a family law case, and it had a lot of importance on a social level, right? So the fact that the court is saying it's not a case of constitutional importance is completely unrelated to whether or not it's important. Does that make sense? So I don't think that's a well-chosen quote. And just on a similar note, I would caution you against just philosophizing about cases in a way that's unrelated to your paper. So you do that at the beginning where you say there's a cruel irony, unanticipated turn of fate. I see what you're trying to do there, which is a nice idea, which is to make it more readable and accessible, but I think it detracts a little bit from the argument, so I would cut down on that. But otherwise, as I said, I think it's a really, really, really good paper. I think the analysis of the cases, particularly Naz, is really outstanding. I just think if you cut down in the ways that I said, and maybe tighten this up a little bit, I could see this paper being published and see it being published somewhere very good. So good job. Darshan?
It went into depth about things. So I have a few broad comments. One of the comments that I have is in all three cases you seem to have three distinct stages, as you said, but it also has three distinct stakeholders, right? So there's one social movement that the court sides with.
Yeah.
In doing so, it acts as a disruptive agent to start a second, and then the government starts trying to repair the demos. So what's essentially happening is the court is acting as a demos disruptive agent where it actually breaks the demos, and then the government starts trying to patch things up again. I found that like a really interesting interaction that you maybe want to explore. I don't know, I haven't really explored something like this, but it's super interesting because that's actually the court acting as a disruptive agent. So it's doing a task which is always constitutional. So in the court with Shah Banu, they actually said that it's not a constitutional case, is having a constitutional impact, which is on the entire population of the country or the demos of the country that can sometimes be constitutionally created. So I thought that's really interesting because the court is constitutive of something else, like another social reality that's being created by these cases. So I found that something that's really interesting that could possibly be explored. In terms of very specific comments, I really enjoyed the method of footnoting because when I was actually going through your footnotes, I was reading a lot of the articles that you had noted in the Hindu and things like that. And that was a really interesting method of going about in terms of this paper in particular, because when you're looking at social movements, you're going through newspapers, is great. But other than that, I think that sometimes, particularly in Shah Banu, I think that there had to be some discussion, at least in the notes, about Cruzan, because what was happening was very similar, which was they were constructing subjectivity, as you mentioned in your paper, which was that Aruna Shanbag was forgotten in the discussion, where they actually gave it to the lawyers. But in certain instances, what they're doing is they're constructing a particular idea of what this subject is. So the subject has not lost its voice after the case, but in fact during the case, which is something I think that could be explored. Because what was going on in cases like Cruzan was they actually said that something she said in the past would be the reason why she would have her life terminated. But in reality, the agency wasn't coming from her, but it was constructed. In Aruna Shanbag, it was a little bit worse, which is she lost agency through the judgment somewhere. Maybe when they assigned Kaju to the case. Not sure. In terms of the Naz decision, it's really interesting again because it goes to this like three-piece thing again, which was the court actually, even in Naz 2009, agitated a particular segment of academics in particular, and they had their own little like queer movement, which was we don't want to have privacy being used because of XYZ reasons. So again, it's really interesting how movements are springing out of what courts are doing in order to side with the movement. So it's factionalizing, but the factionalizing might be creating democracy in a really different light, which is the traditional notion of democracy is what the government's trying to do, which is patch everything up and bring a cohesive demos. But what the court's doing is through agitation, it's creating disagreement, which could possibly be a really agonistic way of looking at Indian democracy, which hasn't been looked at before. But at the same time, I think that's a stretch, but it's worth exploring.
Thank you.